They wore the same uniform. They saluted the same flag. They took the same oath. They walked into the same trenches, under the same bullets, toward the same death. But they knew something others preferred not to think about. The country they were dying for did not consider them equal. And still, when the war came, they stepped forward. Not for applause, not for recognition, but because they believed in an idea that had not yet become reality. Because they wanted to bring closer, with their own blood, a world that didn't yet exist. This is the story of three groups of men that history almost forgot. Tank crews, artillery soldiers, truck drivers. 3 different missions, 3 different paths through the war, and one shared choice: to serve with honor, even when honor was not guaranteed in return. Fall 1944. The American army had broken through Normandy and was pushing deep into Europe. And then command did something it had never done before. For the first time in the history of the United States, an African-American tank battalion was sent into real combat. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers. They knew they were being watched, not as soldiers, as an experiment. Every mistake would be recorded. Every failure would become proof of what the skeptics had been saying for years. Every success would be questioned. Before deployment, they were received by General Patton. George Patton was not a man of gentle words. He stood before them and spoke plainly. "I don't know whether colored soldiers can fight or not, but you have the chance to prove it, to me and to all of America." That was not a compliment. It was a test. They accepted it. The Black Panthers moved through France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany. 680 days of continuous combat. They went first into positions nobody else wanted. They supported infantry in breaking through fortified lines. They took towns that were considered impregnable. Inside the army, they were still unwelcome. White infantrymen sometimes refused to work alongside them. Supplies arrived last. Orders came after everyone else had already received theirs. But on the battlefield, nobody looked at the color of the crew inside the tank that had just saved their life. November 1944, a small town in France. The tank moved slowly down a narrow street between shattered buildings. The commander peered out of the hatch. Too quiet. No movement. No gunfire. No enemy. And that was exactly what frightened him most. Then from around the corner, through smoke and dust, a German panzer rolled into view. Distance, less than 50 meters. The gunner froze for just a fraction of a second. He knew, if he missed, their tank would be the first to burn. 5 men inside, and none of them would get a second chance. "Target, straight ahead, fire!" The shot tore through the silence. Impact. Smoke swallowed the street. The German tank stopped, but didn't catch fire. It could still shoot. The gunner clenched his jaw and reloaded. His hands were trembling, but his movements were precise. Second shot. The Panzer's turret shuddered and erupted in flame. Fire burst from every hatch. The street fell silent again. The commander took a slow breath and said only one thing: "We keep moving." Because for them, this wasn't heroism. This was the job. By the end of the war, the 761st Battalion had received more combat decorations than any other tank unit of the same size in the American Army. Patton changed his position publicly. He stated that the Black Panthers were among the finest soldiers he had ever commanded. They proved everything that had been demanded of them. And still, back home, the sign still read, "Whites only." December 1944. The Ardennes, Belgium. It was supposed to be a quiet sector of the front. The Allies were already celebrating. The war seemed to be winding down. Germany was retreating. Victory was a matter of time. Nobody expected what happened next. On December 16th, the Germans struck. 30 divisions, 200,000 soldiers. Hitler's last great offensive on the Western Front, the operation Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge. The blow was sudden, massive, and brutal. German armored columns broke through the front at multiple points simultaneously. Communications went down. Units were cut off. Command lost the picture of the battle entirely. Here, near Malmedy, stood the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, African-American artillery soldiers. They held their positions, covering the retreat of Allied forces, while the Germans pressed from every direction. They understood the brutal truth. If they left, others would die. If they stayed, they might die themselves. There was no heroic speech in front of the ranks. There was only a quiet, terrible choice, made in the dark, in the snow, without cameras, and without witnesses. They stayed. December 17th, 1944, the Ardennes. The crew had been firing for hours without stop. Shell after shell disappeared into the darkness of the forest, toward the German tanks grinding down the snow-covered road. Communications with command had gone silent. Neighboring units had pulled back. They were alone. The gunner lowered his eyes for a moment and quietly asked, "Sir, if they get any closer, we won't have time to get out." The commander said nothing. The wind drove snow across the position. Then he answered calmly, "Then we keep firing until they do." Everyone understood what that meant. The shells were running low. Every shot could be the last. But the crew kept working, slowly, precisely, without panic. The last shell disappeared into the night. A few minutes later, the sound of engines rose from the darkness. The Germans were very close now. Someone whispered, "We did everything we could." Nobody answered. They simply stayed at their guns until the end. When the Germans closed in on their position, part of the battalion was trapped. 8 soldiers were taken prisoner by SS troops. The SS did not take them to a camp. They shot them. Not in combat. After they had surrendered. Prisoners of war, shot by the side of a road in a Belgian forest. This crime became part of the broader Malmedy massacre, where SS forces killed American prisoners from white units as well. But the fate of these 8 specific soldiers from the 333rd remained in the shadow of even that story. The newspapers didn't write about them. Their names were not carved onto the major monuments. They held the line to the last. They died as soldiers, and almost nobody remembered them. Sometimes holding the line means accepting that history may never know your name. Summer, 1944. Normandy was behind them. The Allies were advancing. And then, the army stopped. Not because the Germans were holding firm, not because they were running out of men, but because they were running out of fuel. Patton was halting tanks in the middle of French fields, not because of the enemy, but because the tanks were empty. An army without gasoline is scrap metal on wheels. Command created a system that had never existed before. A continuous convoy of trucks, day and night, along specially designated roads closed to all other traffic. Red circles painted on roadside signs marking the route, which is where the name came from, the Red Ball Express. 70% of the drivers in these convoys were African American. They didn't take hills. They didn't capture cities. They didn't receive medals for assaults. They sat behind the wheel for 18 hours at a stretch, on broken roads, under threat of airstrikes, in rain and in darkness. They slept 2 hours in the cab and drove again. Their dilemma was quiet but real. Slow down and protect themselves, or keep moving and keep the advance alive. Night after night, they chose to keep moving. October 1944, a French highway, the middle of the night. The driver had been behind the wheel for 16 hours straight. Rain hammered the windshield in sheets. The wipers scraped back and forth, barely keeping up. In the beam of the headlights, there was only a narrow strip of wet road stretching into the darkness. His eyes started to close on their own. He slapped himself hard across the face. He could not stop. If he stopped, the convoy slowed. If the convoy slowed, the tanks ran dry. And if the tanks ran dry, the advance died. Then a sound from above. An aircraft somewhere in the low clouds. Instinctively, he killed the headlights. The entire convoy plunged into darkness at once. A few seconds, just the sound of rain and the steady rumble of engines. The plane passed. Headlights blinked back on one by one down the line. The convoy rolled forward. The driver exhaled slowly and whispered to himself, "Just a little more, just until dawn," and pressed harder on the gas. In 3 months, the Red Ball Express transported nearly 500,000 tons of supplies. Fuel for Patton's tanks, shells for the artillery, food for the infantry. Without this convoy, the Allied advance would have stopped. The Germans would have had time to regroup. The war would have dragged on for months, maybe years. They won the war in logistics, the war without which no other victory would have been possible. Their names never made it into the history books. May 1945. The war in Europe was over. Victorious armies returned home to the sound of orchestras and the cheers of crowds. America celebrated, loudly, genuinely, with a relief that had been building for 4 years. And in those columns of victors, they marched too. The tank crews of the 761st, who had moved through 6 countries. The surviving artillery soldiers of the 333rd, who had lost brothers in the snows of the Ardennes. The drivers of the Red Ball Express, who had collectively driven the distance from the Earth to the Moon. They came home. And at home, the same signs were waiting for them. Whites only. The same buses where they were directed to the back seats. The same doors they weren't permitted to enter. Some were arrested for refusing to give up their seat. Some were beaten on the streets of American cities, in uniform, with decorations on their chests. 3 roles, 3 different paths through the war, but one shared question that each of them had carried forward: serve with honor, even when honor is not guaranteed in return. Their answer was, yes. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. Every day, every night, every mile of road, every shell fired, every meter of captured ground. But something did change. In 1948, President Truman signed an executive order desegregating the United States Armed Forces. Not immediately, not without resistance, but it was the first official crack in the system. Many historians believe that without the combat record of African American soldiers in World War II, that order would have come much later. The seeds planted on the fields of France and in the snows of the Ardennes grew into the streets of Montgomery, Birmingham, and Washington. The civil rights movement rose in part from this contradiction. Too sharp, too obvious, too impossible to ignore forever. The 761st Battalion received a Presidential Unit Citation in 1978, 33 years after the war ended. The names of the soldiers of the 333rd Artillery are now on a memorial in Belgium. The history of the Red Ball Express is taught in military academies as a model of logistical genius. Late, but better late than never. We tend to think of heroism as a moment, a flash, an explosion. One man against the entire world. Beautiful, simple, convenient for a textbook. But these men tell a different story. Their heroism was not in one moment. It was in thousands of small decisions, every day, every night, in mud and in snow, in the cab of a truck and behind an artillery breach, to keep going. Not because the system was fair. It wasn't. Not because their country was giving back what they were giving. It wasn't. But because they believed in an idea that was bigger than the system. Tank crews, artillery soldiers, truck drivers. Without the Black Panthers, Patton would not have broken through the defensive line. Without the 333rd Battalion, the Germans would have pushed further into the Ardennes. Without the Red Ball Express, the Allied army would have stopped in the middle of a French road with empty fuel tanks. They were invisible, and they held the war on their shoulders. History is sometimes unjust. It forgets those who don't fit into a convenient narrative, those who are too uncomfortable, too complex, too contradictory for a simple textbook. But the truth is heavier than any textbook. They fought 2 wars at the same time. One, against Nazism in Europe. The other, against the prejudice inside their own army and their own country. In both, they did not surrender. Honor is not tested when everything is fair. Honor is tested when everything is unfair, and they passed that test.